Okay, so like Gary said, I'm a professional services engineer with Puppet Labs. That means that I do consulting and training. I think some of you were even in my training class this week recently. Hi, guys. So this talk is sort of meant to be very introductory. I'm going to go over some basic Puppet concepts for those of you who might be Windows admins who have never actually used Puppet before. However, I'm not going to teach you how to use Puppet, so those of you who are already bored don't have to leave right away. We're going to quickly talk about how the Windows agent is set up and installed, some of the things that you need to be concerned about with that. I'm going to go over the Puppet resource model, sort of how our catalog works, and basics of types and providers, at least for context, so you can understand how this works on Windows. And we'll talk about some of the comparisons between Linux and Windows. How is it really different between these two operating systems? And then some specific challenges on Windows that are kind of unique to Windows, resources that just don't make sense in a Unix environment, and some things about Windows that are really weird that will probably hurt you if you're not careful. So Puppet on Windows has been around for a couple of years now. It's growing a lot. I've been to some companies where they use Windows exclusively and manage it with Puppet. We support these platforms. Technically, you might find that it works on desktop OSs too, although we don't really support Windows XP because Microsoft doesn't. So to get it installed, it's a really simple, basic Windows MSI installation. I think any Windows admin has seen a screen that looks almost exactly like this, although the logo might not be as pretty. We have just a simple MSI file. You can double-click it if that's your thing. It gives you a nice graphical interface with some basic questions that you can answer. Those of you who are more, I don't want to say real admins, I have this option available where you can just run it from a command line. And we provide 3 options. There may be more than that right now, 3 different options for things that you can set. Basically, you can run this automatically during your Windows bootstrap process and make sure that your agent is up and can talk to your masters. You can also set the cert name, which I'd say is very important. So once it's there, it runs as a simple Windows service. The screenshot here is from the services.msc screen. Similar to on Linux, where you'd be running an init script, Puppet in Windows, you just run off of a basic Windows service. So on the Windows installer, the paths are slightly different, but you'll find that they're pretty similar to the Linux ones once you get deeper down. These two up here in the program files directory under Puppet Labs Puppet, we have a sys and a bin directory. I implore you to never mess with those. Unless you really, really know what you're doing, there's a very good chance that it could bite you. But be aware that they're there. All of the executables and batch scripts that we use to launch a Ruby instance to run the Windows agent are located in here in some way. Again, though, please don't mess with them. These ones, on the other hand, might be a little bit more flexible. Depending on what version of Windows you're on, you could be in C Program Data Puppet Labs, which is for versions 2008 and later. If you're on an older operating system like 2003, you'll find it in Documents and Settings, All Users, Application Data Puppet Labs. So just be aware of that. This is actually resolving the app data variable to find where those go. And within that directory, we have a var directory and an etc directory. These pretty much mirror what you've got on a Linux machine. The cache data, for instance, your cached catalog, latest report that ran, you're going to find in the var directory, as well as any plugins that get synced. So in any Puppet run, if you have custom Ruby code, it gets synced down to this plugins directory. And so that's where you'll find that stuff. Generally speaking, you don't need to mess with that. It probably won't hurt too much stuff if you do. The agent run will be able to replace it if you mess stuff up. I would call that one a read only if you want to poke around. And then finally, the etc directory is where we have the actual configuration. Again, very similar to the Linux path. It's just been sort of ported to a different base directory in Windows. You have your puppet.conf file, which you probably will want to edit at some point or at least manage directly with Puppet. And we have the SSL data directory, which is where your certificates go. If you ever run into a certificate issue, that's the directory that you want to delete to regen your certs. Okay? Really quick, how many people here are currently using Puppet on Windows? That's more than I thought. And how many people are using Windows but not Puppet? Okay, that's about what I expected. All right, this is largely for you guys, I think. So the way that Puppet basically works, we have this process of sending data back and forth once or twice between the agent and the master. All of the actual processing where decisions are made about how your machine is supposed to look is done by the master, where the agent only provides data about itself and then is responsible for actually applying those decisions. So whenever you're working in Puppet, always keep in mind that this is the flow that everything goes on. First, the node sends up information about itself. The master compiles a catalog and sends it back to the agent, which is responsible for actually enforcing the configurations that you specified. Okay? I would say that this right here is basically Puppet in a nutshell. This is one of the most important things that you can understand about it. So for those of you who are new to Puppet, if you learn nothing else, learn this. And then when we're actually applying these changes to the system, we do this through something called resources, which is a special interface, sort of an abstraction that Puppet uses to make it really easy to manage things. So this sort of abstraction layer provides a series of types, which are things like basic objects that you'd want to be managing on your system. For instance, the file type manages files, obviously, and the package type manages packages. You Unix and Linux admins are probably very familiar with packages. Windows admins maybe not as much, but you probably should be. And of course, services and users and all that classic stuff. Now, to actually make these changes, Puppet types are pretty generic. They work pretty much the same on most systems in terms of how you define them. However, the providers are the actual key aspect. So these things do all the work. They're written in Ruby and Puppet. If you're writing them for Windows, you'll probably use some sort of Windows APIs or call out to Windows programs. But these are responsible for checking the status of resources and updating them. Okay, so the providers are really the heavy lifting here. And when you want to get Puppet to work on a brand new operating system that you haven't really used it on before, the providers are where you really need stuff to work. Okay, that's the part where you might have something extra that needs to happen. We've done a lot of the work for various Linux distributions, and we've done a lot of the work for Windows too. If you guys are trying to get more advanced about this, you want to look into writing your own custom providers. Many of them, hopefully, for the Puppet native types, although we've got those pretty well covered, I think. You may want to write your own at some point for other things, which we'll get to in a bit. So the actual Puppet code looks like this. Here's a simple managing of a couple of resources in Linux. I think even if you've never seen Puppet, if you've never used Linux, if you're a Windows admin, you can kind of figure out what this means. We want to make sure that a web server is running, and we want to make sure that a user that needs that service is also available. So why is Windows special here? What really makes Windows different from Linux in this sense? Like, we've got types, we've got providers, Windows has files, Windows has services, Windows has packages, right? And the answer that you'll find is that it's really not that different in terms of how you conceptually manage your systems, how things are supposed to look, or what sort of components are there. There are differences, but at least at a superficial level, there really aren't that many. For instance, take the host resource. This is one of our native resources that manages DNS hosts on a machine. On a Linux machine, this will edit lines in your /etc/hosts file. Whereas on Windows, it just edits your C Windows System32 drivers etc hosts file. The only problem with Windows here is that they have ridiculously long paths for some reason. Service is the same, right? You want to have a service SSHD running to have remote access to your Linux system. We enable a service like this. If you want to have remote access to a Windows system, the only thing that's really different is that you want to have the terminal service running so that you can get RDP access. So you Windows admins are probably really familiar with this screen. This is what it would look like for terminal services. If you stop this, that's the equivalent basically of a Linux admin stopping SSHD. This is how people will get graphical access into your system. And as we can see from this slide, it's really the same kind of way to manage them. Basically, because we have these providers, these great providers that are underneath that, you say service, whether it's Linux or Windows, and Puppet can figure it out. Okay? So the cron resource. Linux admins are very familiar with this. This is how you run things periodically. So how do we run things periodically in Windows? What's our cron equivalent? I can't just run this on Windows because Windows doesn't have cron. We start to see an actual difference here. So the scheduled task resource in Windows is what allows us to do the same thing. Both of these slides will end up managing this runjob.batch file to have it periodically every month wake up and run it. This will work with this trigger. There's a number of options here. I implore you to check out docs.puppetlabs.com to see more of them. Those of you who are in my training know that that's my favorite website in the entire world. This here will run it monthly. Again, the same thing. This job works on both Windows and Linux. But we start to see an important difference here in that there are some key Windows concepts that just don't translate, and vice versa. So for these, we need to have custom types or special modules that are able to do that. Now, before I get into showing you some of these, I just want to talk about some of the more difficult pieces that just Windows has a completely alien concept that any POSIX-based operating system has, and that's the way that files are handled. And the two key ones here are the way that Windows does paths and the way that Windows does line endings. These are the kind of things that you always have to be aware of, and those of you who manage multiple operating systems, both Windows and Linux, have probably gotten bit by this before, even without Puppet. So The key here, if you remember the slide that I showed before where we were showing the cycle of how the Puppet catalog is generated, where the master is making decisions about how things are supposed to look and the agent is applying them. You need to think, whenever you're dealing with a file, what is going to be managing this? What is evaluating this code that I have here? Is the master deciding what the exact text of the file should be, or is the agent deciding that? Because on Puppet, only the master can only run on Linux. So you've got to have a Linux master that's got Linux paths and Linux line endings, and the master needs to look for things and manage them in that way. But the Windows machine has no concept of that. So always think about that. So Puppet provides some easy ways to translate that, especially for things like paths. So take, for instance, Windows loves to do this backslash thing instead of forward slashes, which I think is weird, but they do it anyway. Any of these three options are going to work on a Windows machine. Puppet will automatically translate forward slashes into backslashes if Puppet needs to handle that path. Okay? Similarly, if we use single quotes, the backslashes will be disregarded. They'll be treated like a regular backslash instead of as an escape character. And then finally, if you're using double quotes, which allows for a thing called variable interpolation, where escape characters will actually do something, you simply escape the backslash. Now, all of these will basically work. You should probably try to use the forward slashes if you can, so that you avoid confusion with escape characters. Maybe your double backslash gets passed into something else that also wants to escape backslashes, and might treat your second backslash as an escape character or something like that. It's kind of like writing a SQL injection exploit, actually. So try to use forward slashes when you can, except when that path is being read by a Windows machine. Okay? So for instance, here we have a scheduled task that we're setting up to run cjobs runjob.exe. That string right there for the command is what's going to be passed to the scheduled task. Windows will try to execute that program and it will fail, because it won't be able to find that path, because that makes no sense to Windows. Okay? So line endings is the other one. Anybody who's ever copied a file from a Windows machine to a Linux machine has probably seen something like this and wonder, why does it do that to me? It's really annoying. The problem here is that Windows uses a carriage return line feed in order to specify what character ends a line, whereas Linux uses just a simple line feed character. So that confusion there is possibly going to cause you problems, especially since the Puppet master is running on Linux. And the Puppet master, if it's generating strings with new lines, like if you put a \n in your code, that's going to end up creating a regular line feed as opposed to a carriage return line feed. So you need to be aware of how that might come back to bite you. Just keep in mind, remember what I said before, think about where this code is being evaluated. Is it the Windows machine that's looking at this, or is it your master that's looking at it? Now, a great way to get around this, you can't really use files dynamically this way, but the file resource in Puppet, which if you use the source property, will copy everything down in binary. So it doesn't matter what kind of line endings you have. It doesn't even matter if your file is not ASCII text. The source entry will copy it down perfectly. Content, on the other hand, which generates these templates, if you have code that's generating actual multiple lines in there, it will use Linux-style line endings, not Windows ones. Okay, so one possible way that you can get around this if you're not generating the code is to use the, or even for the source, is to use the Unix to DOS utility on your machine, and that will convert the line endings to Windows style. Just keep in mind that you're going to need to keep separate files for your Windows machines than you use for your Linux machines. So if you have services that use both and they aren't going to be aware of the line endings, you need to be aware of that. Okay? The other part is file permissions. So I like to rag on Windows a lot. A lot of people do, I think. But Windows file permissions are actually way more versatile than Linux. You can do things like include groups within groups. You can, the ACLs are much more obvious. You really only are dealing with NTFS, so you don't have like the different conflicts between what kind of file system you're running and how does it handle ACLs. So in Puppet, to specify these, you still use a Unix-style mode. This is because the file type is what's aware of what's specifying what that's going to be, not the provider. The provider doesn't check to see that you have a valid, that doesn't check the validity of the mode or anything like that. The type's going to do it. So you still use a Unix-style mode in Windows. And if you're going to specify any owner or group to own a file, you need to specify that using that Unix-style mode, which is actually not as bad as you'd think. This piece of code here sets the owner, administrator, and the group users on a given file with mode 644, which to you Windows people, that means that the owner can read and write, and then everybody else can read. And here's what that's basically going to look like. We have the users group is able to read and write. Okay? So the last one is the permissions. Be very careful of the case of your files. This one gets interesting because Windows is case insensitive, whereas Puppet is case sensitive. So if you define a file as having a certain case and it exists differently on your target system, Puppet will think that the file doesn't exist, and then when it tries to create it, it will be recreating that file. So watch out for case. Just try to keep it consistent. Pretend that Windows is a case-sensitive file system. When you're doing this, it's going to make it a lot easier if you're just solid with that. And then the other thing, you can't set the SID on a file. Okay, you can set things by username, and Puppet will use the Windows tools to resolve that, but there isn't currently a way to actually set the SID directly on the off chance that you actually care about that. I rarely run into places where people actually do. So the exec resource. This is something that Windows admins will typically resort to whenever they need to change something. The types and providers might not be enough, the ones that ship with Puppet. I think generally they're great for a lot of things, but a lot of people just say, I need to run this command. This is how I do things. If I change my application host configuration on my Windows machine, I need to restart my IIS server. I need to run the IIS reset command. So here we have just a simple exec. Notice that the path here is using /. Puppet is interpreting that path for where it's going to look up the file, and that'll run C Windows System32 IIS reset. Okay, and this will happen anytime that application host.config file is updated. This will reload the configuration. Now, another important thing to note here is that exec does not run within cmd.exe. Okay, it's not like invoking a shell and running it, it's just running the command directly. So if you need to use shell built-ins, you're going to need to do something like this, say command/c, and then run the dir command, which is not actually an executable. Okay? So along those lines, there's kind of a small problem you need to be aware of is 32-bit redirection. So you may have run into this on your Windows systems without Puppet, where you run you have a 32-bit program and you're trying to run a 64-bit executable with it. So Puppet runs in 32-bit on Windows. This is a problem due to the way that Ruby works. So we have to run it in 32-bit on Windows. If you are running on a 64-bit system and you want to execute a 64-bit application, Windows will actually automatically remap, because they're so nice to you, they will remap that executable to point to the 32-bit location, even though you want to run the 64-bit one. And we're not talking about running the actual executable within Puppet's namespace or within Ruby itself. We're talking about starting a separate shell to execute it. So Windows will see that it's a 32-bit app that's running it, and even though you're trying to run a 64-bit application, it'll try to look for the 32-bit one. And in many cases, you're going to see that you can't actually find that file. I've seen this bite a lot of people. So the workaround for this, Windows provides this sysnative directory, where if you call an executable directly from there, it will avoid doing this file system redirection. So it'll actually try to run the thing that you really do want to run instead of the one that it thinks that you probably want to run. So that's a really useful workaround, I think, to be aware of. So PowerShell is all the rage right now. I think it's like God's gift to Windows admins. It makes it a lot easier to do a lot of things. And if PowerShell gets a lot bigger, it's basically going to almost maybe possibly put Windows on par with Linux. The rest of you, please don't throw things at me. So here's one way that you would execute a PowerShell command. Those of you who've been running them from a shell before know that you have to set the execution policy to remote signed so that you don't have to actually have your script cryptographically signed before you execute it, which I guess is just a pain. So here we run PowerShell.exe, we set the execution policy, we pass in an argument of the file that we want to run, which contains our script, and we give a path of where that actual script resides, or where the PowerShell binary resides. Okay? This is kind of a mouthful. It's not really easy to look at code like this. Fortunately, Josh Cooper, who's sitting right there in the third row, who would love to answer questions about it, by the way, we have a PowerShell exec provider, which allows the exec resource in Puppet to natively run PowerShell code. You don't need to put all that crap to say remote execution policy and all the full path to the PowerShell.exe. We can just pass commandlets directly into the exec. So if you're writing execs in Windows, and if you're writing execs in Windows, you're probably using PowerShell to do a lot of your execution. I urge you to check out this provider. It's awesome. It's going to make your life a lot easier, and it's going to make your code a lot easier to read. All you have to do is set provider PowerShell in the exec after you've installed the Forge module. And since I'm talking about Forge modules, I think it's important to note here, just because something needs to be a module, I don't consider that to be a flaw in Puppet. It's a really good idea, I think, to have as many things modularized as possible. In fact, I would argue that we have too many things in core Puppet, and more of them should be modules. Especially when you're talking about esoteric platforms like Windows or AIX or something. You don't want to build that into core unless it's something that really applies to every operating system. So when you have Windows-specific things that you want to manage that don't make sense anywhere else, you should probably write that as a separate module and not try to actually edit core Puppet or something like that. Okay? So those of you who don't know about it, I hope that nobody doesn't know about it at this point because this is PuppetConf. Check out forge.puppetlabs.com or use the Puppet module tool to search for modules and install them. Okay? There's a lot of really great Windows modules out there. For instance, this one, PuppetLabs Registry. So next to execs, this is probably the most common way I've seen people try to manage things in Windows now is just using this registry key. Thank God I haven't seen too many people running execs to manage the registry. This registry type in provider allows you to set keys like here, HKey local machine system test key. We make sure that that registry key exists, and we make sure that it has a specific string value because this string value is very important to have on my systems right now. Simplified to that, there's a defined type called registry value that sort of does the whole thing, and you can make sure that this whole specific registry path actually exists there. Commonly, I find on Linux machines, you want to do almost everything with file, right? All your configs are in files. In Windows, I wouldn't say all, but many of them are in the registry. And so instead of going package file service as you would on a Linux machine, you'll often find yourself going package registry service on a Windows machine. Okay? So this edits just simple registry key. Those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when I say registry probably know exactly what I'm talking about right now. It's that big messy thing that's really disorganized in Windows but somehow makes everything break. So this here will just set that registry key like this. So another really cool one is this adenning winntp module on the Forge. This is really simple, just sets what your NTP server is supposed to be. This is what I think the interface to managing things in Windows should look like. You grab a Forge module, you just say, I want this winntp class, and I want it to have these settings, I'm done. You don't need to think about any of this. I don't need to tell you that under the hood in this module, he's actually using actually editing the registry to set that value. How many of you really want to dig into the registry anyway to try to find where something is supposed to be set? So this makes it a lot easier. This one here from simondean sets up a share on a Windows machine. So this will share the P drive out so that we have repositories available, or in this example, to have repositories available. And you'll see why it's really helpful to set up some sort of external share in Puppet that might hold packages when we talk about how Windows handles actual package installation. Another really good one, this one came out just recently from Tom Lincoln, one of our PSEs, to handle domain membership on a Windows system. It's an unavoidable fact that when you're trying to manage domain membership, you need a service account and you need to somewhere expose that password in your automation. So that's where we have that here. I would suggest that you use something like an encrypted backend like Hiera or something to actually manage that password. But here we just set what the domain membership of our machine is supposed to be. We're going to have our machine must be a member of example.com, and we're going to use this service account to do it. There's a couple of extra really neat features of this that allow you to do things like change the computer password. I don't know if any of you have ever had to do that on Windows. I know that I have, and that's a pain. But some cool things like that. So also a good one to check out. Many more of these modules are available. There is no time to talk about them all. In fact, I think since yesterday when I last checked my slides, a whole bunch of new modules have been added. Actually, this OpenTable IIS one was just added today when I talked to the guy who wrote it and told him, hey, you should put this on the Forge. Paul Stack, by the way, really smart guy. We have a SQL Server module that manages SQL Server. Adenning also made a Windows Fax module. This one's great for managing actual fax, particularly on desktop machines. You'll get things like what kind of monitor is attached and how the video card works and interesting things like that that are really useful for a Windows desktop. And also this MSUAC class, which does the first thing that any Windows admin ever does, is disable UAC. Linux guys who have ever troubleshot SE Linux now are also laughing at this because they know the exact same pattern. Search for Windows on forge.puppetlabs.com. I bet you that by the time that my talk is finished, there will be even more modules up there. People are constantly working more and more on Windows, and the more that you guys contribute to it, the better it gets for everybody. If you're lucky, people will contribute back to your modules, and it'll make everybody's lives a lot easier. So really quickly, I want to talk about packages. This is kind of a weak spot for Windows generally. I call this the MSI Package Provider because prior to Puppet 3.0, this was the way that you could manage packages. We say that we want MySQL installed, and we give a source MSI file for it to grab the installation from. You can also specify specific install directories or arguments using the install options type. That's one of the few things that are Windows only. As of Puppet 3, we have a special built-in Windows package provider. It's selected automatically. You don't need to tell it to use it, and it can natively support EXE and MSI. A backport is also available on the Forge so that you can use this Windows type-in provider on Puppet 2.7. Okay, so please don't use the MSI provider anymore. If you're on Puppet 3 or older, the Windows one is much better. Unfortunately, these still kind of give us a problem, right? Linux is really easy to manage packages. You don't need to pass RPMs and debs around to get your stuff installed. You have yum, you have apt-get, you have zipper, whatever, things like that. These are versionable, they're upgradable. It's easy to change between versions. Windows, finally, has something very similar, written by Rob Reynolds, who's sitting over there and would also love to talk to you, is this tool called Chocolatey that is basically apt-get for Windows. And you can use Chocolatey to actually directly install these, kind of unrelated to Puppet. Rob, by the way, is going to have a couple of talks later. He'll have a hands-on demo, I think, at 3:20 tomorrow, where you can go and check and play around with Chocolatey. Now, Rich Siegel over at the International Securities Exchange, where they're using Windows very heavily, has actually written a provider in Puppet for Chocolatey. So this right here, just as easy as installing a package on Linux, you have a way to install packages on Windows. This makes sure that sysinternals is installed, and any Windows admin should have that installed. Okay, now really quickly I want to talk about this DISM thing. I think I'm running a little bit low on time. This is essentially the roles and features that's in Windows 2008 and later. The PuppetLabs DISM module will help you manage that, do things like install DHCP servers or DNS servers. Really simple like this. Here we're installing .NET. DISM, NetFX3, ensure present. Piece of cake, right? The DISM, the underpinnings of this are probably going away pretty soon. Microsoft is going heavily on PowerShell towards this. So I suggest you also check out the open table namespace on the Forge. Just last night, Paul Stack released a Windows feature module that does all of this using native PowerShell. So the one last thing that I want to talk about real quick is rebooting, which is a thing that's kind of a pain point that's mostly unique to Windows users, where you have to reboot after every single freaking thing. Here we have just a simple exec that calls shutdown.exe and has the machine power off in 5 minutes, or has the machine restart rather in 5 minutes. This can be a problem, for instance, if your catalog is still running while that happens. You're also kind of guessing and hoping that the restart's going to happen at the right time. There could be different dependencies that could force you to restart in the middle of your process. Say, for instance, you're installing SQL Server, it wants to reboot, and then you need to do something else after that. How do you handle not trying to manage those resources later in the catalog? This is actually not going to cut it. So some people argue that rebooting is actually an orchestration problem, and even if it's necessary to do tons of reboots in Windows for configuration, you should not ever have something automatically restarting their system. I often agree with these people, so a typical approach to this is to have a simple exec that really doesn't do anything. That just says we have a reboot pending, have that set to be refresh only and no op true. That means this exec will only ever find its way into the catalog where it actually needs to run if something else before it has changed. In this case, say our driver update came through. We need to reboot the system. Now I say no op true so that this exec doesn't actually run anything and instead gives us a little option in the report to say there is a pending change on this system. And we can see this splat if you're using the Puppet Enterprise console or Puppet dashboard, and I think Foreman does something similar. That'll show you like, oh, this machine needs you to do something, and when you look at the report, you'll see it needs a reboot. Probably still not the best way, and so Josh Cooper, again, saving the day, has given us this Windows Reboot resource. This will actually call the shutdown command, but before it does it, it will abort applying the Puppet catalog. So any resources that have not yet been managed, Puppet will just give up on them. It'll exit the catalog run, it'll submit its report, and then the machine will reboot at a certain time. We can set this to be interactive so that people can stop the reboot if they're using the system at the time that it comes up too. We're really looking for feedback on this, so if anybody has reboot problems, please tell Josh, please tell anyone at Puppet Labs. There are tickets on projects that you can update. We want to know what the best workflow for you is for how you're supposed to do this kind of reboot. I think everybody has a different opinion on the best way to do this. So some more great resources that are out there. If you go to docs.puppetlabs.com/windows, that's all the documentation, or most of the documentation that we have right now for Windows and the core type. You'll find that I probably plagiarized most of my talk off of that webpage, so it's a really good one to check out. Also check out our type reference. This explains how the Puppet core types work on both Windows and Linux, but all the details that you need to know about the Windows providers are often there as well. There's a great blog post. I think there's a couple blog posts and some webcasts that we have on our webpage if you want to see more about that information. And not related directly to Windows, but I suggest you all also check out the Puppet Types and Providers book by Dan Bode and Nan Liu. Nan is actually going to be here tomorrow doing a workshop in Types and Providers, so you might want to check that out. What Windows really needs is more providers. So you guys know how you're supposed to manage your systems. You got to write people writing those providers will make the ecosystem better for everybody. So definitely worth checking out. And that's it for now. I hope to field some questions. There's a mic over there if anybody wants to step up and ask me something, or if you want to not ask questions, then we can all leave early. Just step up to the mic, please, if you have a question. Sorry, I'm making you walk.
So you talked about ACLs and that they're not particularly handled. There are some cases where you do need to handle more complex ACLs. I wonder, do you see that being better implemented with a new type or some sort of complex implementation of the same, of a provider for the file type?
Are you reading my mind? Yes. I think that a new type is probably the best way to do that. I haven't seen anyone do that. Complex ACLs is kind of a tricky situation in Linux as well, where we don't have a way to sort of natively manage these. So how do you extend those types? It's my personal opinion that a separate type would be the way to do that. And if you're writing the type, to have an auto requires on the file that you're actually managing. I think that would be the best way to do that. It just doesn't exist right now. Thank you for that question.
Are you able to run both Linux clients and Windows clients from either the same tree or different environments in that tree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Puppet master is what's making these catalog compilation decisions. You just want to make sure that code that will only apply successfully on Windows doesn't end up on your Linux machines. And there's all kinds of conditional logic and stuff available for that. I've never seen somebody who actually has a separate Windows-only Puppet master versus their Linux-only Puppet master.
Thank you.
I have to admit, I'm a Windows admin.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. I get that a lot. I have some problems with Puppet in that I have to manage or replicate in Puppet with classes and groups, the same thing that I do in Active Directory, where I'd really like Puppet to be able to read what I've already got set up in Active Directory for maybe groups the computer belongs to. Is there some sort of way that I can use that to factor into my modules that I'm writing to say, all right, if you're a member of that group, do this?
So really quick, what do you mean by groups on the systems? You're talking about like you have certain groups that need to have certain configuration settings applied
Not
to them?
Not local groups, no.
What's that?
I'm saying Active Directory security groups. If I put in a lump of servers that are part of an app tier, okay, I want that to mean something in Puppet rather than me have to do it in AD and then do it in the Puppet console.
So you're talking about, for classification. Okay, yeah. So there is, I believe, a Hira LDAP backend. There may be, maybe not. If there isn't, one could be easily written. But what you want to do is have Puppet talk to LDAP and get that information out. And I think that's certainly doable, although I haven't seen a direct example of it. I would, off the top of my head, say that's the best way to approach that, though.
Okay, thank you.
And I was curious, I was wondering if there's going to be support for this or if there's any modules out there. The two things I came across is one for the user's resource. They use the UID to be the SID. But what if you're using Active Directory for a shared environment so that the Linux is configured to do the PAM module to go into the LDAP Kerberos environment? And so suddenly your SID, you actually have a UID for the Linux. And you also have SID, but it's called UID.
I see, yeah. So you don't want to, what you probably want to do is try to not set that, like have a conditional in your Puppet code so it's undef on the Windows machine, and then leave it that way on the Linux machine. Puppet on Windows will not actually connect to Active Directory to make changes to the user accounts. It just changes the users as they already exist on the system. And in fact, our user resource here also only manages the local system users. Now, it can use like Active Directory users to apply changes to a file or something like that, but it can't actually make any changes into Active Directory on the managed node.
Yeah. And then another thing, too, I was wondering if there's going to be future support to this or if there's a module out there in the community, is for the Windows services. There's a limited number of, what do they call that type? Entities for, the entities for the service type. And one of the things that's very important to me is, for example, we had RabMQ on a Windows box. We have to insert and install like SPN for that and for the service and configure that. And then there's other things is we actually have to configure the ACLs on the services. And that's just required for like a software as a service ASP.NET stack.
Yeah, I believe there is a feature request out right now on that. I'm not sure what the actual roadmap for providing support for that is, but I would agree with you that that's pretty important.
Okay. And then there's one last question for Cooper.
Yeah, that's definitely one for Cooper, I think. He's going to be like, James, stop telling people.
For the PowerShell, I saw that. That was really awesome. And I was wondering, in our environment, we have a requirement to set the the .NET runtime environment explicitly for which PowerShell executes under. And so there's different, as in Windows, they're not forward, backwards compatible. You have all these .NETs lying around, and so we have to specify a particular .NET environment for the PowerShell execution environment.
Right.
And I was
you set
wondering if we
that
could configure that.
as a
That'd be-
command line argument to PowerShell.exe when you do that?
No, it's
or-
actually really nasty. You have to set up an XML file inside the directory and then put some XML stuff in there.
Yeah, that does sound brutal. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry, but I'll look into that.
That'd
by
be
the-
like a feature request if it's not there for that module.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, projects.puppetlabs.com, you guys can file any feature requests on this stuff, and we'll definitely look at them. Our community is, again, it's largely Linux and Unix, so we're always looking for feedback from people who live in the trenches in Windows. I fortunately got out of that life a long time ago.
Hi. Does Puppet Apply work on Windows? And if it does it alter how templates work with line endings?
I'm not sure about the templates, actually. I haven't tried that, but Puppet Apply definitely does work in Windows. I would give it a shot. It's the easiest way to find out.
I don't actually have any Windows machines, but just
Oh,
out of
yeah.
interest.
No, that's right. I thought you were a Linux admin. Any more?
I think this is more of a feature request, but currently there's no way to install the Windows agent with the cloud provider.
With the yeah.
And
Noted.
That's my use case.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's something on projects.puppetlabs.com for that right now, but that should be added. There is? Okay, yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, so Josh says there is one. I would log on and add a +1 to that if you're very interested.
Okay.
I think we're still trying to gauge where interest lies on cloud provisioner and what people really want out of it.
Thanks.
Okay, so there's my contact information up there. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to email me. If you're like, James, you're just a client-facing person, I don't want to talk to you, forward me on to Josh. I'd be happy to do that too, and you can blow up his inbox. Yeah, you're very welcome. You can find me on IRC as SuperCow, or you can hit me up on Twitter. I'd love to talk to anybody or answer anything more about this after, and of course I'll be walking around and feel free to get me. Paul Stack, by the way, is doing a talk later on his actual in the trenches experience, implementing lots of stuff with Windows and PowerShell. Rob, the author of Chocolatey, now a Puppet Labs employee, is going to have 2 talks later, and I'm sure that Josh as well, anybody would love to talk to you more about it. So feel free to grab me or them or anything like that if you'd like to know more. So thanks everybody.